Ladies, listen. So let's go through this. So today we're going to start with refractory period. So read what that says. So the muscle relaxes after contractory period because they need to repolarize. You can't see nothing. I love that it's kicking me off when I do this. So anyway, back to the idea here. Now you can see it. Good. So this refractory period, your muscles need to relax so they can contract again. So you contract your muscle and it's contracted and you're here. If you want it to contract again or continue contracting, it can continue to contract, but when you relax it, it needs to repolarize. It goes through a refractory period before it can move again. So it can only go so fast back and forth. Does that make sense? It can only contract. It needs to relax, repolarize, and then it can contract again. For everyone, it's different. It depends on your biochemistry. It depends on the muscle, how well it's trained. It depends on your age. It depends on so many factors. So this refractory period stops us from doing what we're capable of doing sometimes. Does that make sense? So I am mystified sometimes when I watch people doing pull-ups because some people are freaks and they can do like 14, 15, 16, 20 pull-ups. How is that the case? This refractory period is the reason why they got to go hang, and they can't go right away because it needs to repolarize. And you take notice, even in your own self, it's longer and longer and longer the more you do. Why? Because the ionic calcium is missing. It needs to be replenished. Eventually, the ionic calcium will be gone. When it's gone, you can't contract your muscle. It is most people, not everyone, but most people that do not have the willpower, the gumption to drive themselves to make it that they can no longer contract their muscles. I've only ever known a few human beings that could do that. And it's like my wrestling coach used to say in college, you'll pass out before you die. It's not a great thing to tell a kid. Okay. It is true, but it is not a great thing to tell a kid. So the 6 steps of the excitation, contraction, coupling, that just goes through the different steps. The thing to understand, it's all based on intra, means inside, okay, calcium, intracellular calcium. So the calcium is the problem, right? When we talk about muscle contractions and the ideas of cramps and the ideas of the failure of the muscle, it is calcium. So as you see, ionic calcium and muscle contraction, right here we are. So the effects are the calcium is there so that the muscle can contract. The lack thereof means we will not get the contraction. There are some debilitating diseases that are based on the lack of this calcium. Very debilitating. And we'll talk about those later on. So how does a muscle actually contract? Here are the 4 steps. So you have the cross bridge formation. So the myosin heads become attracted to the actin sites. And then what happens is you end up with the power stroke. The myosin slides past the actin like this. It looks like this, 2 V's coming together. And then once that's done, the muscle is contracted. The next step is 3, cross-bridge detachment. ATP is involved. Energy is needed for them to relax or to come back apart. And then once it comes back apart, you'll end up with a cocking phase. That's like the waiting period. Like if you're jumping, skipping, whatever, this up and down, right? You can only go so fast. Why? Because your muscle needs to land. You need to land. The muscle needs to relax, recock itself, and then it can go again. Again, the more often the contraction, the greater time that it takes. Make sense? Now, the last thing I want to talk about here is something that you need to really, really understand. And if you're like my wife, who's a little crazy, she made me watch this Night Stalker thing on Netflix. Oh my, do not watch that, kids. That's crazy. God, drives nuts. But what we're going to talk about today here is rigor mortis. Familiar with what it is? You sure? Let me give you a definition and stuff like that, and we'll talk about the importance. So rigor mortis illustrates the fact that cross-bridge detachment is ATP driven. Why? All the ATP gets used up because a person's dead. They're not making more ATP. So what happens about 12 hours after death? The muscles contract, and there's rigor. They become rigid, like completely rigid. Why? Because the muscles are contracting in both directions. If you think about it, if I want to curl my arm or bring my hand to my face, I use my bicep. If I want to extend my arm, I use my tricep, right? If they're both contracted, my arm stays in the same spot. Go ahead and move it. You can't. Why? Because the muscles are pulling in both directions. Rigor mortis. All the muscles contract. Why? Because there's no more ATP to relax them. When you get a cramp or that Charlie horse, what is that? The ATP is missing from the muscle. What happens to the muscle? The muscle goes and contracts, and you're like, ah, right? Why stretching it take it away? Anybody know? We'll talk about that later. We'll talk about when we talk about lactic acid. Anyway, so back to this definition. So this proves the ATP, this is an ATP-driven thing, that most muscles begin to stiffen 3 to 4 hours after death. The peak rigidity is 12 hours after death. It dissipates for the next 48 to 60 hours. The dying cells are unable to exclude calcium and calcium influx in the muscles. So this promotes the myosin-actin cross bridges. Just like when your muscle contracts, that's what it promotes. Kind of crazy, right? Why are we interested in this? Because we use this in forensics. For any of you that are interested in forensics, this is an important thing. Huge important thing. Crazy important thing. Everybody understand how this works? Because the calcium's there, that's what fires the muscles and so on and so forth. It kind of proves the whole point. Tomorrow, real quick, I just want to give you a little heads up here. So tomorrow we're going to do how the muscles actually do contract. We'll talk about motor units and my favorite thing, which is muscle twitch. We will talk about that, which is crazy. We'll talk about myograms, graded muscle responses, why you don't punch yourself in the face when you scratch your head, stuff like that. And then response versus stimulus, which is something that you need to understand, like how your muscles actually work in that way. We'll get to complete tetanus, which is something you should all strive for at some point in your life. It's a challenge that everybody can do because you determine it. It's your will. Okay, so